Well, good afternoon, everybody, and a very big welcome to the Buddhist Society anniversary talk. It's the 14th of November, and we're now chugging our way through the lockdown, which this is the first time we've had an anniversary on such circumstances, which means our speaker will be on the phone, and you'll all be on Zoom. Our speaker doesn't have the technology to go onto Zoom, but he'll be joining us through the phone, and there will be a slide presentation. Before I get into the actual meat of introducing Alexander, I will say that there will be a break at 3:35, and that will be for 5 minutes, and then there will be another break at, I assume, 4:35. Is that right, Alexander?
Yes, exactly right, Desmond.
4:35, and then there'll be time for questions. Now, as far as questions go, there's two ways of doing it. One is at the end of the talk, you can wave your hand, but the other way is to write the question in. At the bottom, you'll see a dialog box, a chat box, and you just write your question into that. So now, to get into the introductions, we're very honored to have Alexander Maitland with us today. He's a very distinguished writer and great friend of the Society, and has given quite a few talks for us on important occasions. And today we're talking about two important people, because the Society, as you know, is very much involved with bringing Buddhism to the West. And as part of that, we do look at the lives of people who have contributed to that over the years. And Arthur Waley could be considered to be quite a major figure because of his extraordinary ability at being able to translate from the Chinese and Japanese in a very fluent way. And if you remember, some of you will have read Monkey, which is probably one of the books that made him most popular, where it was just a novel written in, I think, the 17th century by Wu Sheng-en and translated into English. It's been translated many, many times, but I think Arthur Waley's translation is still the best by far of all the translations that I've seen. This book has been, and then this book was taken up and it's been made into films and videos and all sorts of things, even a comic. We've even seen a comic. And the Zen Center has actually a comic strip version of it. And it does actually bring with it, you know, the story of Tripitaka, the bringing of the text from India to China, led by the monkey, and all the mischief and naughty things that he gets up to on his way and all his adventures. And it's a very entertaining and wonderfully written book. He really actually gets the feeling of the book in an extraordinary way. So Arthur Waley, an important figure. Also his translation of poetry was wonderful. And then Beryl de Zoete. Questions about how the name is presented, but we're using de Zoete, who is also an important figure in terms of dance and so on. But I'm not going to take up any more time, but just to say a very big thank you to you, Alexander, for giving this talk today about Arthur Waley and Beryl de Zoete, their relationship, and thank you very much, and look forward now to your talk. Thank you so much, Alexander.
Thank you, Desmond. That was splendid. The other mind is the state of ecstasy entered by Balinese dancers. Then a quote from Arthur Waley's translation of Hagoromo. But not yet are they numbered, the dances of the East. And a quotation from Beryl de Zoete. I'm not at all good at being learned, but everything I speak of I have seen with my own eyes and felt with my own heart. To write a book, like living, is to incur far more obligations than one can ever hope adequately to discharge. I have made up my mind only to make poems when I feel inclined to. I object strongly to being perpetually thrust forward and made to behave as though I thought myself a genius. And that's an extract from the Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon, Makuro no Soshi, translated in 1928 by Arthur Waley. Now, the first image you can probably see now is Beryl de Zoete, sitting in a very large room and lost in thought. Beryl de Zoete first visited Ceylon in spring 1935, the year that the final volume of Arthur Waley's acclaimed translation of The Tale of Genji was published. Beryl had been invited to Ceylon by Dr. Malarasekara, a friend of her elder sister, Florence. Malarasekara was professor of Pali at the University of Ceylon and one of the island's foremost Buddhists and Buddhist scholars. To Beryl, he appeared a learned and a most intelligent man whose immense energy of mind and body made him a stimulating but never fatiguing companion, who, she wrote, showed me Ceylon in a way that I could never otherwise have seen it. Looking back in 1948, she compared a program of awkward new dances that she had seen during her second visit to Ceylon, as it was then called, with descriptions translated by Arthur Waley in The Tale of Genji, of the Empress Akiko Nomo's spring devotions introduced by new dances, which in contrast to those Beryl had found so disappointing, were steeped in the musical traditions, the poetry, and religious ritual of the court, and so beautiful that everyone wished they might go on forever. Beryl de Zoete and Arthur Waley met for the first time in 1918, according to Waley's sister-in-law, at a party given in Bayswater by Edith Sitwell. They had literary interests in common, and their ways of looking at life seemed to harmonize. Some friends of Waley described him as shy, while others felt intimidated by his impermeable silences. For Beryl, however, it had been love at first sight. She was original, undomesticated, generous, and without guile. She needed neither marriage nor children, was content to take second place to Arthur's writing, and offered him a relationship that appeared the ideal solution to his work-orientated, gregarious, and yet strangely isolated existence. The de Zoetes had emigrated to England from Holland towards the end of the 18th century. Drusilla Kent, Beryl's mother, was English, Her father, Edward Frank de Zoete, worked as a wholesale dealer at the London stock market. The second of four daughters, Beryl de Zoete, was born on the 17th of August 1879 and brought up at the family's home in Streatham. Little is known about her formal education except that an indulgent headmistress had encouraged her to join classes in Greek conversation. Later, she read English at Somerville College, Oxford, where she graduated in 1901 with a second-class degree. And by then, she spoke and wrote fluently in French, German, and Italian. In 1905, Beryl wrote a book about the homes of the early Franciscans, and in 1907, assisted by her friend May Sturge Henderson, a book on Venice. She also translated from Italian the second volume of Dr. Giulio Carotti's three-volume History of Art. In 1913 to 1915, Beryl studied eurythmics, solfège, simply solfa, and improvisation, a method combining physical movement and music devised by the Swiss composer Émile Jacques Dalcroze, whose photograph you can see now, partly at his modernistic Bildungsanstalt in Hellerau near Dresden, and partly in London. She revered Jacques Dalcroze, whom she called the irresistible little professor, or else referred to as her master. Hellerau, which she described as a huge school of very mixed talent, varied ambitions, and a babel of tongues, became very popular with students of music and dance, but was eventually shut down by the Nazis. Beryl also taught eurythmics to children, a practice warmly encouraged by Jacques Dalcroze, who believed that children should be trained to become conscious of their personalities, to develop their temperaments, and to liberate their particular rhythms of individual life from every trammeling influence. When she met Arthur Waley, Beryl was 39 years old, dark-haired, slender, and extremely attractive. Her impossibly idealistic marriage in 1902 to the writer Basil de Selincourt had ended in divorce after de Selincourt broke their agreement to a platonic relationship devoted to music and literature and based on a strictly vegetarian diet. Almost exactly 10 years younger than Beryl, Waley was born on the 19th of August and baptized at Tunbridge Wells. He was the second of David Frederick Schloss and Rachel Waley's three sons. His father, David, was an economist employed at the Board of Trade. Both of his parents came from Ashkenazi Jewish backgrounds in Eastern Europe. Arthur boarded first at a small preparatory school in Kent, followed by Rugby and King's College, Cambridge, where he read classics. In 1914, to avoid the prejudice in Britain against anybody with ostensibly German connections, Arthur, his parents, and his brothers, Sigismund and Hubert, changed their surnames from Schloss to Waley. On one occasion, asked whether or not she had Jewish blood, for some reason, Beryl, who was far from being racist or anti-Semitic, became very animated and replied emphatically that her family were High Church Anglicans. In 1916, Arthur Waley translated and had privately printed a collection of 52 Chinese poems. His collected translations of 170 Chinese poems were published by Constable in June 1918. This book was well received and helped to establish his literary reputation. Although it wasn't a bestseller in any grandiose sense, the sales were at any rate sufficient to refute the gloomy predictions of about a dozen people at a meeting in Bloomsbury Square of Roger Fry's Omega workshops, whose estimates of its sales had varied from 20 copies to none. The picture that you're looking at now is of Arthur Waley, painted by Roger Fry, and his characteristic style. Since 1913, the year the Omega workshops were founded, Waley had been employed as assistant keeper under Lawrence Binyon at the British Museum's recently established sub-department of Oriental prints and drawings. When he applied for the post, Waley had stated that he was able to read easily Italian, Dutch, and Portuguese, and that he also read and spoke fluently in French, German, and Spanish. To these he added Hebrew and Sanskrit, as well as Latin and Greek, in which he had obtained first-class honors at Cambridge. He had left the university in 1910 without completing the tripos after a serious illness. As a result of this, he permanently lost almost entirely the sight of one eye. According to one of his sponsors, Sidney Cockrell, Waley possessed a remarkable intellect and was very much interested in art and music. While another sponsor, Oswald Sickert, brother of the painter Walter Sickert and a friend of Lawrence Binyon, described Waley as a young man of exceptional intelligence and originality. Being unfit for military service in the First World War, Waley worked at the museum and taught himself to read classical Chinese and classical Japanese, which enabled him to describe English paintings in the museum's collection and produce an index of Chinese painters, which the trustees published in 1922. Waley's descriptions of the paintings remained in manuscript, except for some material incorporated in his book An Introduction to Chinese Painting, published the following year. Also included in the book was his lengthy iconographic note on the Bodhidharma, which he had written for the museum's catalogue on Chinese paintings. His successor, Basil Gray, remarked, "There can surely never have been a museum department like that, whose sole staff was a pair of poets, Lawrence Binyon and Arthur Waley." There's no doubt that Waley influenced the development of his department, and as Gray also points out, the museum and its tradition of independent scholarship had a formative influence on Waley's work, which persisted after he retired in 1929 due to health concerns and his decision to devote himself from then on to literary work of his own choosing. Long before the first of the Tale of Genji's 6 volumes appeared in 1925, Waley's interests had embraced the art and literature of Japan. He produced a catalogue of the museum's collection of rare 17th and 19th century Japanese books, illustrated with woodcuts and fine examples of color printing selected by Waley and purchased by him for the museum at auction sales in Paris after the First World War. If these subjects failed to greatly arouse his enthusiasm, the catalogue was a splendid example of Waley's care and exemplary thoroughness. That done, he turned his attention next to Buddhist paintings brought to England in 1908 by their discoverer, Sir Aurel Stein, together with manuscripts and other treasures from the walled chamber in Tien Pho Tung, near the city of Tunhuang in western Kansu province. At intervals from June 1913 and more or less continuously from 1925 until he left the British Museum in 1929, Waley devoted much of his time to the task of cataloguing Stein's rich and important collection. The next photograph is of the American poet from Idaho, Ezra Pound. Waley's interest in Chinese and Japanese poetry and the idea of translating these poems was inspired by Ezra Pound, who encouraged him to publish them, admired his scholarship, but in private criticized examples of what he regarded as Waley's bungled English. To work at the museum and translate poetry, Waley taught himself simultaneously to read the classical Chinese and classical Japanese confined exclusively to literature. Waley never traveled to China or to Japan, and he did not speak either language except for a few phrases which he pronounced with some difficulty. His interest in Chinese and Japanese was essentially historical, and according to his friends, did not extend much beyond the 10th or 11th century. Waley's artistic eye, however, was discriminating, and this enabled him to write his definitive study of Chinese painting, which remains to this day a standard work of reference. But instead of the composition, style, and subject matter of these paintings, his attention as often as not focused on the legends, the calligraphy that accompanied them. Buddhism was inseparable from Waley's writings and translations. Japanese poetry, Yuta, published in 1919. Zen Buddhism and its relation to art, from the introduction to his study of Chinese painting from 1923. And no less remarkable, the life and times of Po Chui, published in 1949, a tour de force, recreated largely from Waley's intuitive reading of Poe's verse as a primary and indeed almost exclusive source of biographical information. In The Way and Its Power, a study of the Tao Te Ching, Waley traced the evolution of Zen's wordless doctrine as a psychological heir of 4th and 3rd century Chinese quietism. Writing thus in 1934, he foretold quite correctly that Zen, which has played so great a part in the spiritual life of China and Japan, is probably destined to exert before long a considerable influence in the West. References to Buddhism, likewise, recur through Beryl's study of dance and magic drama in Ceylon, today's Sri Lanka, as they do to a lesser extent in the Hindu-influenced dance and dance drama of Bali. In Bali, South India, and Ceylon, although she acquired enough vocabulary to comprehend the various dance forms and their intricate movements, she had often with her someone, such as Walter Spies, who you see in the photograph, in Bali, who provided an informed commentary, leaving her free to observe and make careful notes on the performance. Spies was accommodating, knowledgeable, and generally, though by no means always, deferred to Beryl's appraisals of Balinese dances and dancers. In a letter written from Bali to his mother, Spies confided that there had been clashes of temperament, and dauernd Zankereien und Feigheit over. But these differences had all been forgotten, and jetzt ist alles wieder gut, he wrote. Now everything is fine again. And in the same letter, Spies praised Beryl's writing as sehr lebendig und teilweise sehr schön, very lively and sometimes very beautiful. And he told his mother that he would like to work with her again. Spies was impeccably blonde, impeccably handsome, and vigorous. He was born in Moscow in 1895 into a family established in Russia for centuries. After the First World War, Spies, his brothers and sisters, all of whom except one were musicians, studied at Hellerau with Jacques Delcroze. It has been suggested that Spies and Beryl first met at Hellerau, yet if this is true, it seems strange that Beryl should not have mentioned it in any of her books. Spies was very gifted and had a privileged artistic education. The pianist-composer Edward Erdmann introduced him to Busoni and Hindemith. He studied piano with Arthur Schnabel, and he took lessons in painting with Oskar Kokoschka.
Walter Spies, the first European artist to settle in Bali almost 100 years ago. His life was a spectacular one, venerated by the Balinese until today, forgotten by the Germans.
The Canadian composer Colin McPhee, who knew Spies in Bali, described his paintings as enchanting and dreamlike. In 1959, Kokoschka told Edward Roditi, the poet and translator, "I try to teach my students how to see. Painting remains a visual art, and a painter who refuses to see and to observe is voluntarily impoverishing his art. Dreams and visions should be as visible to the artist as the phenomena of the objective world." Shadowy tropical landscapes with beautiful figures characterize much of Spies' painting in Bali. It seems safe to assume that Kokoschka's advice had come either as a complete revelation to Spies, or else it affirmed and clarified his leanings towards what we might describe as mystical realism. Mystical realism, a style he reinvented for himself, in which McPhee defined as half Persian miniature, half Rousseau. In this visionary world, there were familiar echoes of Beryl. Everything I speak of, I have seen with my own eyes and felt with my own heart. Spies, it is said, disliked authority, intimacy, and being thought to take things seriously. He was much more than a dilettante, however, but diverted praise by asserting his amateur status. Here, no doubt, Beryl noticed some resemblance between Spies and Arthur Waley, whose public displays of absorption in his Oriental texts could be likened to Spies' denial of seriousness as a means of self-protection. According to the American anthropologist Margaret Mead, the very dissociated impersonality of the island of Bali gave Spies the kind of freedom that he sought. And Beryl's friend, the anthropologist Claire Holt, thought him transparent. If he avoided intimate involvement, he also made no demands. The late Dr. Marion Urey, whose essay, written 35 years ago, remains the best source of personal information on Beryl, has described Beryl also as transparent. She writes, "The term might better be translucent. Her intent is to make us see not herself, but what she sees, colored by her feelings about it." Nowhere, as the narrator, does Beryl intrude on visual experience except to share certain observations, for example, of Balinese dancers' ability or technique, or by recreating intuitive yet precise evocations of atmosphere which cannot easily be conveyed in descriptive visual terms. And here again, we see Cecil Beaton's beautiful image of Beryl in pensive mood. Beryl's significant journeys abroad began in 1928 to 1931 with long sojourns, sometimes by herself, sometimes with companions, in Fez and other parts of Morocco. These journeys coincided with Arthur Waley's retirement from the Department of Prints and Drawings, after which he pursued his Oriental studies in a succession of homes which he and Beryl shared within reassuringly close proximity to the British Museum. From 1920 to 23, Cartwright Gardens. 36, Gordon Square from 1924 to 33, and 50 Gordon Square, where they lived from 1936 to 1962 in an upper-story flat previously occupied by Clive and Vanessa Bell. Clive Bell being the critic, theoretician and artist, Vanessa being herself a painter trained at the Royal Academy and sister of Virginia Woolf, married to Leonard. So they were all very much part of the Bloomsbury group. In the 1920s, when Roger Fry was still obsessed with Bell's doctrine of significant form, Waley showed Fry copies of Chinese paintings, which he said were Zen, and that any attempt to understand them in terms of form alone was meaningless. This, Fry assured Waley, was impossible, but years afterwards he conceded that Waley's argument might, after all, have something in it. Arthur Waley's flats, as a rule, contained nothing of very great value, and all were very simply furnished. According to Dr. Marion Urey, Waley and Beryl had the reputation of keeping an exceptionally frugal table. Guests invited to supper were offered an invariable meal of tinned beans, accompanied by hothouse grapes and good wine. Beryl's fondness for serving weak tea in dainty cups enraged some of Arthur's friends, who took it as an unbearable affectation, and they were enraged further when she forbade tobacco in her rooms and offered herbal cigarettes as a substitute. Marion Urey adds that none of this would deserve much notice, were it not that the Waleys' dining habits figure so largely in other people's reminiscences. From the beginning, Beryl and Arthur had taken a serious interest in each other's writing. Beryl's books contained frequent, often gratuitous quotations from works by Arthur Waley, which, if nothing else, served as reminders of their close association. Waley, according to a mutual friend, suggested that Beryl translated the Confessions of Zeno by Italo Svevo, and Alberto Moravia's novella Agostino. These, in 1930 and 1949, and possibly another novel by Svevo, As a Man Grows Older in 1932. In 1925, as a gesture of love, Waley dedicated to Beryl the romantic first volume of The Tale of Genji, and to Beryl and their friend, Harold Acton, his 1942 translation of the 16th century novel Monkey by Wu Cheng-en, originally titled Journey to the West, which Edith Sitwell thought at once lovely and strange, like a dream turning real, and like reality turning into a dream. Beryl's extended study of dance in Bali, India, and Ceylon began when she saw for the first time a performance of Balinese dancers in 1931 at the Exposition Coloniale in the Parc de Vincennes in Paris. A 6-month journey of dance study in the countries which still retained the background of Hindu culture led Beryl first to Java and then Bali in 1934. In December 1934, she and Walter Spies planned their book, Dance and Drama in Bali. Her first visits to India and Ceylon followed in April and May 1935. The whole of 1936 until the end of spring 1937, Beryl spent in Bali, where she rented one of the houses owned by Spies and traveled with him all over the island, gathering detailed notes and impressions of traditional dance and dance drama. While Beryl observed and wrote, Spies took a great many photographs, of which more than 100 were chosen to illustrate their book. Meanwhile, Beryl and Arthur Waley corresponded, eager for news, impatient for replies. No matter how absorbing, fascinating, and time-consuming their work, sensing that they missed one another provided each of them with reassurance, and in lonelier moments with a sense of comfort. From 1934 to 1939, Waley published 5 books which he had either written or translated. In 1934, The Way and Its Power, the 6th and last volume of The Tale of Genji in 1935, The Book of Songs in 1937, in 1938, The Analects of Confucius, and in 1939, 3 Ways of Thought in Ancient China. Exhausted by his work on The Tale of Genji, Waley recalled in the Real Tripitaka in 1952 how the aging 7th century monk and translator Xuanzang, who had brought back to China the Buddhist idealist writings from India, wearily declined to undertake a translation of the heap of jewels, the 49 Ratnakuta texts. Waley wrote, "I remember my own feelings when, having completed the 6 volumes of The Tale of Genji, I was asked to set to work upon The Dream of the Red Chamber, a book of almost equal length." From 1933 until 1936, when Beryl was often away from London, Waley lived and laboured in a room at the Russell Hotel in Bloomsbury before moving to the flat at 50 Gordon Square, which he would share with Beryl for 26 years until her death. At that period, Arthur Waley was at the height of his powers as a poet, scholar, and interpretative artist, able to translate and recreate, rather than reproduce slavishly, a word-perfect translation from the original. In Professor J.M. Cohen's view, nothing emphasized Dr. Waley's preeminence in this field of recreation more than his 30-year-old No Plays of Japan, a work first published in 1921 when Waley was occupied already with his books on Chinese painters and painting. The plays make use of the Buddhist conception of earthbound spirits, still attached by their desires to the scene of their worldly lives, to lend distance to the drama which is generally viewed in retrospect. There is, Waley writes, no possibility of crude realities. A vision of life, indeed, but painted with the colors of memory, longing, or regret. It's almost certain that Ezra Pound had steered Waley towards no theatre, besides encouraging his interest in translating Chinese and Japanese poetry. In 1908 to 1913, Ernest Fenollosa's unpublished writings on No were given to Pound by Fenollosa's widow, Mary, and they would almost certainly have been discussed by Pound and Waley. At that time, Pound was drawn to Confucius, and only later did he become interested in Buddhism and the Taoist aphorisms of Lao Tse. Waley's fascination by Zen may be traced to these discussions with Pound, who in turn had been influenced by Yoni Noguchi, a poet and translator who lived in America, whose book, The Spirit of Japanese Poetry, was published in 1914. Comparing Busong's haiku, The Night of the Spring, oh, between the eve and the dawn, with the prose equivalent in the pillow book of Sei Shonagon, translated by Arthur Waley. I love to watch the dawn grow gradually whiter and whiter till a faint rosy tinge crowns the mountain's crest, and so on. Noguchi much preferred the haiku's vividness and intensity. Excited by the instantaneousness and the spontaneity of Zen, Ezra Pound communicated this revelation to Waley, who at once became enthusiastic. By spring 1937, Beryl had completed her long sojourn in Bali, and the results of her research had been impressive. In his preface to Dance and Drama in Bali in 1938, Arthur Waley took pains to point out certain ways in which this book, both in its material and method, contributes something new to the history of human culture. He quoted Professor Malinowski's view that in the study of primitive folklore and native decorative art, of dancing and music, we shall find elements which may prove almost completely refractory to scientific analysis, and yet will have to be recorded. Here, the anthropologist may have to cease to be a mere analytic man of science. He may have to become almost an artist. Although Beryl de Zoete had no formal training in anthropology, Waley clearly believed that Malinowski's principle applied to her work, and that the value of her book had been greatly enhanced by the writer's ability to convey feelings as well as facts, and her instinct for perceiving just at what points the methods of the analyst ought to be replaced by those of the poet. In 12 chapters, Beryl described with brilliant clarity the astonishing variety of Balinese dance and dance drama. Very beautiful film of the ceremonial Lagong, filmed in 1933. shortly before Beryl de Zoete first arrived in Bali. The photograph that you see now is of a Balis dancer. Most splendid of all, the ceremonial Balis, whose name means a line, file, or a formation, had more than 20 variations, 7 of which were performed at the cremation of the Javanese monarch Hajam Virik, celebrated in the Kadung Senda, a romance of the Majapahit dynasty. The Rajang temple dance Beryl found perfectly performed with a quite peculiar beauty in 3 villages named Asak, Batuang, and Tanganang, and the thrilling Jalonarong, which tells the dramatic tale of a witch, a widow queen, was performed at night when the influences of magic were most powerful. She saw the weird beauty of Gabor, another temple dance, and Rajang, in every degree of perfection, from tiny girls going through their paces to old withered hags who still move entranced in the slow measure they have danced since their childhood, flapping their skinny wings like crows and dancing with a kind of absorbed intensity, which is often even beautiful. She wrote of Bali, "No one, of course, learns to dance in a general way. One only learns a particular dance, the training for each being necessarily different. An entirely different technique has to be learned for Baris and Kabir, for example, and one would need a special teacher for each." Now, the 112 photographs which illustrate dance and drama in Bali, all but 2 were taken by Walter Spies. Of the others, 1 was taken by Beryl and 1 by Rudolf Bonnet, a Dutch artist also resident in Bali, who, together with Spies and their sponsor Kokalta, Prince Gedi Agung Sukawati of Ubud, founded the Balinese Painters Cooperative, Pita Maha, which means great or noble aspiration, in 1936. Although Spies encouraged young Balinese to paint subjects from daily life, such as markets, rice planting, harvesting, temple festivals, and dance performances, he himself continued to explore a world of dreams and visions, like the scene from a Barong play, which he photographed early in 1937 at Pagdiotan, with 3 rangdas, or witches, in a ghostly setting overhung by palm fronds, half hidden by mist. With a limited knowledge of the history of Balinese culture, and without too much resort to theory, Beryl endeavored to understand and to relate what it is the mythical, mysterious creature known as Barong dances, and why. The Barong, she explained, would seem undoubtedly to the class of protective animal. The protective lion of Buddhism, which in Buddhist pictures of Indian origin is not shown as a realistic lion, but something much more like the Balinese Barong, is perhaps derived from a pre-Buddhistic protective friend of the ancestor, a monster of the same kind and kin as Rangda. He is even regarded, Beryl suggested, in a mystical tantric interpretation by a Hindu priest as actually an emanation of Rangda, won over by offerings to take the part of the villagers against her. Whereas Baris, Gabor, and Rajang are regarded as ceremonial dances in Bali, Barong and Jalonarong are part of the drama of magic. Beryl wrote, all dancing in Bali has a religious background, whether it be an offering, a prayer, an exhibition, or an exorcism. In general, these elements are combined, but exorcism is exceptionally important in view of the Balinese fear of evil spirits and need to propitiate them. Dance in Bali is usually accompanied by music. Dance, melody, and the accentuated rhythm of gong, drums, and cymbals form together an indivisible whole. The music is indeed danced, but in a different and a far more intricate way than we understand it in the West. Harking back to the teachings of Jacques Delcroze at Hellerau, Beryl observed, nor is there any eurythmic balance of phrases, as little as in nature. Influenced possibly by daily contact with Spies, she used pictorial imagery to explain the connection between dance and the music's rhythmic structure. The continually recurring, unemphasized melody may perhaps be compared to a pattern repeating itself indefinitely on fabric, which Beryl calls stuff, or wallpaper. Upon this background, the dance winds about, taking its own course. When, as sometimes happens, dance and melody coincide, one becomes conscious of the undercurrent of melody with a shock of delight. The clash and tinkling of a gamelan orchestra has been likened to a shower of golden rain. And now the woman whose photographs you'll see coming up wearing her very attractive spotted jacket and the shirt and tie, looking very nice, is called Alice Bonner. On visits to Switzerland from 1930 onwards, Beryl and Arthur frequently stayed at Davos with the painter, sculptor, art historian, and Indologist Alice Bonner and Georgette, Alice's younger sister, who were family friends of the de Zoetes. It's possible that Beryl and Alice Bonner first met in 1929 in Morocco, when Alice was there with another former student of Jacques Delcroze, the Indian dancer Uday Shankar, whose younger brother Ravi became India's famous sitar virtuoso. Alice had been introduced to Uday Shankar in Zurich in 1926, and in 1930 she traveled with him to India. In 1936, she settled permanently in India at a house on Asi Ghat in Benares, now known as Varanasi, where she continued to paint, but gave up sculpture, which she felt was too slow to capture the rich, ever-changing variety of impressions that surrounded her. She shared Beryl's fascination with dance. In May 1949, Alice traveled with Beryl to Bangalore, where she photographed the 21-year-old dancer Srimati Shanta Rao, whose photograph has now appeared on the screen, one of India's leading exponents of Bharatanatyam, a semi-dramatic dance like Balinese Legong, literally, the dance of Bharata Muni, a legendary sage who is supposed to have formulated under Brahma's guidance the principles of theatrical design and dramatic art. 12 of the superb photographs taken by Alice on that occasion were among those used to illustrate The Other Mind, Beryl's study of dance in South India, published by Victor Gollancz in 1953. Alice Bonan's own book, Principles of Composition in Hindu Sculpture, Cave Temple Period, was published in Leiden in 1962. Alice had begun as an artist, and from her modest home in Varanasi, she devoted years to an analysis of Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain sacred art and sculpture in the caves of Ellora and Ajanta at Aurangabad in Maharashtra, and finally to her studies of India's temple architecture. Beryl was captivated by Shanta's passion for dance, her accomplished performances, and her unwavering dedication. She described Shanta as one of the most gifted creatures I have ever met, who, to Beryl's inexpressible delight, confessed her madness for dance. As a child of 12, at a famous dance school run by the Malayali poet Valatol at Saikur, besides her usual lessons, Shanta had insisted that she must share an arduous course in Kathakali dance, usually restricted to boys. This gave her an incomparable training in strength and freedom of movement, and a very grand style, which was one of her remarkable qualities as a solo dancer in Bharatanatyam. In 1942, she was accepted as a pupil by Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai, who taught her Bharatanatyam at his home in Pandalanore near Madras. The old man's family had for centuries been choreographers and teachers of dance, who 200 years before had designed the choreography of Bharatanatyam as we know it today. Shanta told Beryl, the lessons commenced, and so began the most wonderful period of my life. Despite Beryl's admiration and affection for Shanta, it was Shanta's older contemporary, Bala Saraswati, the diva of Bharatanatyam, whom she praised as one of the greatest dancers of all time. So brilliant was she, Beryl wrote in her book, that I have shown no photographic record, as none can give the faintest impression of that wonderful moment when, with the music, the other mind possesses her and she begins to dance. In autumn 1948, Beryl had arrived first at Bombay, now Mumbai. On 1st December, she left for a 3-month sojourn in Ceylon, and from the end of February 1949 to the end of July, she traveled and studied in India. Studying dance, of course. It was then that Beryl had first met Shanta Rao, Shanta's teacher, Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai, and the other great Bharatanatyam dancer, Bala Saraswati. Beryl divided the next 3 months between Ceylon and India, gathering impressions for The Other Mind, her book on dance in South India, and for dance and magic drama in Ceylon. Incidentally, the book on the left-hand side, the 1973 reprint of Beryl's book Dance and Drama in Bali, has as a cover illustration 2 dancers, and if I'm right about this, if book you're looking at, that painting was painted in Bali by Miguel Covarrubias, who was there with his wife Rose, also studying the traditions of the island of Bali. Dance and magic drama in Ceylon describe the island's colorful dance festivals, the Buddhist shrines and temples. And these she studied before she returned after a succession of postponements to London at the end of October. If much of Beryl's time in Ceylon during 1948 and 49 was spent in quest of a really fine Kahomba Kankaria, the Kandyan magic dance drama, her first experience in Kandy in 1935 of the Parahera, an elaborate procession of elephants with golden howdahs, headsmen, temple guardians, groups of dancers in varying degrees of splendor, left an indelible impression of unpremeditated sheer delight. One of the most vivid descriptions of the Parahera was written in the 17th century by Robert Knox during his years of semi-captivity after being shipwrecked off Ceylon. Thanks to Buddhist friends who brought her to the Temple of the Tooth at Kandy, Beryl was able to witness and record in her diary an energetic dance which prefaced this exceptional ceremony, when men with great coiling bracelets and shoulder pieces, naked torsos, white skirts, and magnificent leather waist belts danced superbly to the accompaniment of singing and tumultuous drumming, with wild motions of the head, splendid leaps and crouching, circling movements involving the whole body. In the procession itself, dancers and drummers interspersed with the slow stream of headsmen and elephants, working themselves into a frenzy. At sunset on the 16th of January 1949, after she arrived back in Ceylon, Beryl visited the Buddhist temple at Degal Dorua, where a young priest with a huge bunch of keys unlocked the carved door, and we entered the outer hall. In the inner chamber, Beryl wrote, candles were lit by the priest, and we examined as best we could the lovely painting on ceiling and walls, a frieze of the Buddha's life, scenes of hell, demons, abstract designs, all exquisitely colored and very harmonious. The Buddha, a figure of great nobility, on which one can meditate in absence, lies behind an old glass window, because the oil dropped on him by pilgrims was spoiling his paint. She wrote, it is one of the most moving and devotional statues I have ever seen. In Ceylon, Beryl traveled continually between Colombo and Kandy, besides excursions along the coast or into the hills, where she visited rock sculptures and Buddhist shrines. During those journeys, her favorite companion, Harry Pieris, an artist whom she liked better than his paintings, was a young man from a large and distinguished family and had trained in London and Paris. Towards the end of her stay, Beryl eventually managed to attend a performance of the Kahomba Kankaria, whose discovery for her had become almost an obsession. It was beautiful, but it did not match her expectations. I believe, she wrote, that as many as 60 dancers and 120 drummers may take part in the really first-class Kahomba Kankaria, and from the magnificence of the much smaller spectacle, I can imagine what the grandeur of the ritual must be. The costume worn by vest dancers is similar to that worn for Kahomba Kankaria, and the magnificent vest silver headdress is illustrated very beautifully in dance and magic drama in Ceylon, a photograph which was a particular favorite of my wife Margaret. Beryl's thoughts often turned to Walter Spies, who had been killed in 1942 when the ship carrying him from Bali to internment in Ceylon was sunk by a Japanese torpedo. No one she met or heard of during her travels in Ceylon could have replaced Spies, except perhaps Hugh Neville, a civil servant who died in 1897, an archaeologist, zoologist, ethnologist, linguist, artist, and collector, whose excitements made Beryl's own heart beat faster, or Lionel Wendt, who died in 1948, not long before she arrived in Ceylon. Wendt, like Spies, had been a gifted musician, a pianist, painter, and photographer, who founded and endowed a 43 group of modern Sinhalese artists, and whose interest in candy and dancers, Beryl felt sure, must have gone far beyond their photogenic character. Spies had died age 47, Lionel Wendt age 44, Hugh Neville age 49. By the time Beryl left Ceylon in October 1949, she had already passed her 70th birthday. For Beryl, Ceylon had been a fascinating, enriching, but at times frustrating experience. During her absence, she wrote more than 60 letters to Arthur, her much-missed soulmate, whom she called Koishiki Hito, you whom I love, you who love. He had taught her how to speak and translate in Japanese, or from Japanese, and this was one of her pet phrases for him, pet names for him. For 3 weeks in February and March 1949, Waley stayed at Davos with Alice and Georgette Boner. Beryl wrote from Madras telling Arthur how a visitor had asked her age, and when she invited him to guess, he had replied, 70. So you will see, she added, what an Eastern journey has done for my appearance. In London, while Beryl wrote articles about dance and worked on her notes from India and Ceylon, Waley continued with his translations and biographies of Chinese poets. The Life and Times of Po Chui had been published while Beryl was in Ceylon. The poetry and career of Lai Po followed in 1950, and in 1956, the study of Yuan Mei, both of which resembled the book on Po Chui insofar as they had to be reconstructed for want of other sources from the poems themselves. The Life and Times of Po Chui is a model of densely wrought prose, free-flowing, yet wonderfully precise, like the Tale of Genji, like Monkey, or like the Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon, It is a work of art by a consummate artist. As a biographer and a translator, Waley's influence was not confined to Western readers. Professor Konishi Junichi wrote in Kokusai Bunka in 1966 that the Lai Po and Wanmei I came to know through Waley were not the same as I had known before, but far closer to me and far clearer. He was able to interpret Chinese culture through his own lucid eyes. Clarity and simplicity were key elements of Waley's life and work. He ate and talked sparingly, paid little heed to his appearance, was intolerant of banal gossip and behavior. In conversation or reading aloud, he spoke quietly, yet his voice was perfectly audible, piercing even in its effect. Waley and Beryl complemented one another both in their idiosyncrasies and temperament. Dr. Carmen Blacker wrote, Beryl had the knack of unfreezing Arthur in his frozen moods, and Sir Harold Acton recalled her beautiful, cooing voice that covered Arthur's silences like a cloak, describing her as a lightning conductor for Waley's staccato directness. Beryl's friend Dicky, Richard Buckle, portrayed her in 1953 as an enchantress sitting at her desk in the calm apartment above the trees, a kind of intellectual Circe, the witch of Gordon Square. Her hair dyed jet black, on each of her fingers silver cabalistic rings that clicked as she drove her fountain pen across the page. Apart from the books she wrote and translated, Beryl had worked as a ballet critic for the Daily Telegraph and the New Statesman, which published her dance criticism for some years after the Second World War. Celia Goodman, who knew her well, described Beryl as very funny, though not exactly witty, while Marion Urey felt that some of her best and wittiest writing appeared in Bali, the monthly journal published by Richard Buckle in 1939, and again after the war from 1946 to 1952. Beryl's last essay, an episode in Candy and Dance, written in 1951, was published in Asiatische Forschungen in 1954 in Germany, and reprinted in Waley's collection The Thunder and the Freshness in 1963. The title, Thunder and Freshness, was originally chosen by Beryl for her book on Ceylon, but rejected by the publisher as being too opaque. And it comes straight from the pen of Keats, and his description of a Bridesvale waterfall at Ambleside in Cumbria. In August 1951, Beryl arrived for the second time that year in Milan, where she had previously reported for ballet on the Maggio Musicale Fiorentino. This time she went on to Trieste to stay with Savevo's widow, Livia Schmitz, and her daughter Letitia. She was enchanted by Livia and her adoration for Savevo, but could not fail to notice how Livia was unable to separate her feelings for him and his work, and thus had no idea of his greatness as a writer. By this remark, Beryl seemed to imply that not only did Arthur Waley know how much she adored him, but that he realized the extent to which she was able to understand and appreciate his genius. In Milan, in Trieste, she felt fatigued, ill, and had little appetite for food. She felt queer, disinclined to talk, and her letters to Waley suggested lapses of recent memory, whilst her handwriting had progressively deteriorated. There may have been other reasons, but dulling of recent memory was a symptom of Huntington's disease, a degenerative affliction of the brain that grew slowly worse and from which Beryl eventually died. In her case, the symptoms had manifested later in life than usual. Waley insisted that she must return immediately to London, but with her senses dimmed by injections of sedatives at the sanatorio in Trieste, Beryl could not understand the urgency of her predicament. After treatment at a London clinic, and weeks recuperating at home, cared for by Arthur, who she said had been an angel, she recovered sufficiently to visit Holland and discuss with Hans Rodius a large book as a commemorative tribute to Walter Spies. Rodius asked Beryl to compile this memorial volume, which was eventually published in 1964, entitled Schon heightened Unrechtum. But she felt in the end obliged to decline. Beryl traveled in 1954 to Brazil, where she attended a folk music congress, and despite disturbed phases and psychotic episodes she suffered in England, she was well enough to visit street carnivals and join the dancing. In 1957, Arthur Waley refused an official invitation to Peking, and instead he sent Beryl there to represent him. She spent a fortnight in China and returned home via Russia with a blue coolie jacket as a souvenir, which she wore continually from then on. For someone of Beryl's ideals of grace and beauty, her illness, for which music and dance, of all things, were recommended therapy, it was especially cruel. Gradually, as she lost control of her actions, she began to suffer involuntary muscular spasms. Having looked younger than her years, she aged rapidly. In 1961, Arthur Waley fell and broke his right wrist. He continued to care for Beryl as best he could, helped by nurses and their old housekeeper, May Thompson. Their flat at number 50 Gordon Square was up five flights of stairs, but in spite of this, Waley shopped both for Beryl and himself. For weeks he was unable to write, but he read aloud to Beryl, who was by then bedridden, conscious, unable to make herself understood, but mentally sharp and fully aware of her surroundings. To Carmen Blacker, she was a tragic figure, shrunken, who lay screwed up in bed like a withered doll, her face skeletally thin, one arm making convulsive movements round her head. On the 4th of March, 1962, Beryl died. The following day, Waley spent the evening with friends. They remembered he talked about her for hours and told us how he had read his Chinese poems to her night after night until only her eyes showed that she understood. Waley drew comfort from a revived relationship with Alison Grant, or Alison Robinson, a New Zealand journalist, one of two women with whom he had had brief affairs in 1929, while Beryl was in North Africa. A month before Waley's death, he and Alison were married. She had not recognized him when they first met and asked if he knew Arthur Waley. He replied, somewhat hesitantly, that he did, adding, "But I don't know him very well." When the lease at Gordon Square expired and was taken back by the University of London, Waley moved to another flat and then to a house in Highgate Village with spectacular views across London. A friend, Michael Sullivan, wrote of meeting him in summer, the year before he left Gordon Square. Beryl was ill, confined to bed. Waley's arm was in a sling. He talked about their flat, still decorated with Vanessa Bell's faded paintings, and about how Sidney Cockerell had introduced him to Turner's drawings when he was 17. Sullivan never forgot the sound of his voice. To recapture this after Waley died, he insisted one only had to read the introduction to 170 Chinese poems. His silences could be rather awful, but among congenial and like-minded friends, for such an austerely honest man, he was wonderful company. A motoring accident in February 1966 crushed part of his spine, which had been weakened already by cancer and had left him paralyzed. He suffered much pain, which he bore with an almost Chinese stoicism, worried about sales of his ballads and stories from Tun Wang, needlessly anxious that he was no longer read, that he'd been forgotten. In 1942, in the midst of war, his friend Edith Sitwell wrote to him after reading Monkey, "How strange it is to come back and realize how hideous people are making the world. Oh, how sad it is when people like you might be left in peace to give one beauty and clearness like this." Arthur Waley died at 50 Southwood Lane, Highgate, on the 27th of June, 1966. His life and writings, like his long relationship with Beryl de Zoete, were inseparable as the life and writings of Po Chui. And when they ceased, all records stopped as suddenly and undramatically as a clock that has run down. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your patience. I hope that you enjoyed the anniversary talk. Thank you, Desmond, Odin, Lavinia, Wando, Marlon. Thank you.
Alexander, that was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much indeed. It was most enjoyable, and it really covered an enormous range of people and time and so on, and it linked a lot of things together. One of the things that intrigued me was actually the title, Other Mind.
Yes.
Because, you know, in those days, to some extent, Buddhism was seen as something other, you know,
yes.
something not actually,
yes.
which we also have. It's just, but as time has passed and we've understood Buddhism more, we've understood the philosophy more, we realize it is not about the other mind, it's about this mind, you know, our own mind, and Western mind and Eastern mind are no real difference. But there was one thing, I wondered what she actually meant by that, because, you know, there is the exoticism of the East, and sometimes there's an impenetrable kind of gulf between Westerners looking at or looking from the outside at Eastern culture. The other thing is that, you know, that her disease, Huntington's disease, is actually, the full name is Huntington's chorea.
Yes.
Here's the Greek name for dance. And I thought that was
Right.
interesting, was actually that, people, when they actually have manifest the disease, they dance. It's as if they're dancing because their body starts to do things and their arms and legs move without any apparent will to do so. You sort of automate from inside from this awful illness. But it was a wonderful, wonderful talk, Alexander, and it led me to think a lot about people of that time and to wonder whether we've, how much change we've really had over the years, and whether,
True.
we still look at Buddhism as from the outside and not as something that intimate and part of us too. But the title, Other Mind, I wonder, could you perhaps comment on that?
Yes. Well, Desmond, thank you so much for that very kind appreciation. And I think you're right about, of course, you're absolutely right about Beryl. To take the second thing first about Huntington's career, I put that in because I just felt that it was more than ironic. It was just unbelievably unfortunate. It was almost cruel, if you like, that somebody who was so elegant and who had lived for beauty and elegance and appreciated, above all things, this combination of beautiful music and beautiful movement, should be afflicted in this way and should actually be in a position when she was dancing about like a puppet, sort of out of control, as it were, and unable to be in control of her life and herself and her movements and everything that she had done. But the other minds, which, of course, which a phrase that she picked up really by translation, I think probably from Walter Spies, in Bali in the 1930s, as I said at the beginning, it really refers to literally the sort of state of the semi-trance state, the ecstatic state that the Balinese dancers enter when they begin to dance. And it's by doing that they're able to perform these remarkable evolutions in space, great leaps and movements, and control the speed of their movements and all the rest of it. They're literally in another state. But the curious thing about it is that, when one reads her writing, her books, the three books, very carefully, especially the first two about Bali and India, you do begin to realize, and you put your finger right on it, and not for the first time, if I may say so. It's something that you very often do in this sort of understated way. But you put your finger right onto it when you drew up that possible distinction between something other and something that was very much part of oneself and one's life. And I think really it was a combination of these two things that she appreciated. But I think she was very conscious of the other mind as being part of oneself, as well as being the inseparable force, if you like, which motivated the dancers quite specifically, but also in a sense represents the sort of inseparable relationship that she had with Arthur Waley and that he had with her. I hope that's a reasonable answer. Does that come close to what you meant?
Yes, I think it does. I think that's a reasonable answer.
Not a complete answer, but
yes, but it does point to something, doesn't it? About that people sometimes need to lose through dance and music and so on. They need to be able to lose their ordinary consciousness or their self-consciousness and enter into a space where they've forgotten themselves by becoming one with music or poetry or any kind of deeply felt experience. But I suppose Buddhism points towards being able to do that without necessarily the necessity of dance. So it's the secular aspect of that, isn't it? Which everyone can participate in without training and so on. The other thing that struck me, and I think is important, is that the late 19th century, earlier 20th century, and including the history of our own society and theosophy and so on, Buddhism was very much an elitist interest. And now we've seen certainly in the 21st century anyway, in the late 20th century, a tremendous democratization of things from the East, from other cultures. and a greater kind of a much deeper, I think, and more profound appreciation of what really the training and teaching, Buddhist teaching, is really about. But I think without these people, without these forerunners, who are able to blaze a trail and bring these things into public awareness, I think it's unlikely that the great interest that, particularly in Zen, came about through interest in Zen Buddhism would have likely to have occurred. So I think that they performed a great job for us all, because the access to often to Buddhism is through, looking at sculpture, for example, or reading Chinese poetry, although it's not directly, one wouldn't say it was Buddhist necessarily, or haiku, which is not necessarily Buddhist either. And looking at paintings, it's intriguing, because there is a sort of sense that it's looking at something from a different point of view, really. And perhaps that's a point of view where there is less of the personal, and there is something else that's really present there.
Something I could have said too also is that, when you think the Buddhist Society, as we have it just now, effectively founded by Christmas Humphreys and his wife in 1924, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly, yes.
And that just falls between, out of interest, it falls between 1923, when Arthur Waley had published his study of Chinese painting, which is which is a very profoundly sort of Buddhist work in its own way, and also, of course, his beginning of his translations of Lady Murasaki's famous novel, The Tale of Genji, in 1925. And I think Arthur Waley would have been very, very much alive to the significance of everything that you've just said.
And there was in London in 1936, I think, the Chinese exhibition.
Yes.
And that coincided with the World Congress of Faiths meeting in London, which took place at the same time as the Chinese exhibition. And that's where Dr. Suzuki, D.T. Suzuki, met Christmas Humphreys for the first time.
Indeed.
The sort of things came together very much, and it's where he actually became interested more in Mahayana Buddhism than in Theravada Buddhism. But I'd like to know if there are questions from the floor, from anyone listening to the talk. I noticed in the chat bar there isn't anything there, but maybe there's somebody in the audience who'd like to ask a question. Lavinia, could you have a look through and see if there's anyone who'd like to ask a question?
Well, people can unmute themselves actually if they'd like to ask a question now.
So would anyone like to unmute and it doesn't matter what the question is. It doesn't have to be anything particularly erudite. So don't be.
Oh no, heaven forbid.
I don't want to ask a question, but I would like to particularly thank. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, yes.
Particularly like to thank Mr. Maitland for a most delightful talk about amazing contributions of two exceptional human beings. It's a most inspiring talk, very, very stimulating. And I particularly wanted to thank you for your range of visual and aural sources, the great care you've taken to accompany your words, which is very much appreciated. I thought the Beaton photograph at Dartington Hall, I think it is, a most wonderful portrait of Beryl. And I just wanted to for a really delightful and very rich talk, which I think will lead a number of us to pursue different avenues that you've touched on this afternoon. Thank you.
That's extremely kind of you, and I'm very touched by that. I've seen the portrait at Dartington. I went down a few years ago to give a talk there with my wife, and we saw the portrait, and it's a very fine one.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Are there any other questions? mean, when we first became interested in, people of my generation became interested in Buddhism, of course it was, we did turn to Arthur Waley's work as a kind of cultural reference, a kind of bridge, really, because his translations are so good. It was a sort of bridge to the Chinese mind, and particularly the Analects of Confucius, Lao Tzu, and so on. It was Taoism and so on. His translations were really quite wonderful, actually. And I wonder, he's extraordinary because he didn't speak Chinese, did he? And he seemed to
no, hardly at all.
He just sort of was able, mysteriously, because that's another mind thing, isn't it? That he was able to enter the mind of the Chinese mind and be able to translate the spirit, the real essence of it, into beautiful English. And quite extraordinary.
That's extraordinary. Well, to do that in combination, and to do it with classical Chinese, which apparently is atrociously difficult to learn, and to do it with classical Japanese. But I think it might have been Marion Yuri, who sadly died just after she had written her sort of collection of materials for a book that she might have done had she lived, about Beryl de Zoete, and it would have been very good, I think. But anyway, she wrote and she said something to the effect that, where was I now? I keep on losing the thread of my thoughts nowadays, Desmond. What were we thinking? I never seem to start a sentence that I haven't written, that I forget what I was going to say. It's an awful thing about old age. We were talking about what were we talking about?
His ability to be able to enter into the mind of the poet.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
He was able.
That's right. That's exactly right. Well, that was exactly it, and he seemed to have that extraordinary capacity to do it. He didn't really sort of take the trouble. He wasn't interested in learning to speak the modern language, but then of course he sort of said, I think he says in that little book he wrote in 1919, the Utah, if that's correct, or Uta, that he says in about 7 pages, of course, pretty well anybody can learn Japanese, classical Japanese, in just a matter of a few weeks. I mean, just a perfectly ordinary education, and you can do it, which is really a pretty wild exaggeration. And nobody's ever been quite sure, I think, whether he was pulling people's legs or whether he meant it. But knowing him, he probably meant it. He probably really meant it. And I think he really believed, because he had that ability himself to enter into a subject that interested him. And for example, he'd no sooner learned classical Japanese when he suddenly realized that the Ainu up in northern Japan had a wonderful sort of literary culture, if one can put it like that, certainly a culture of storytelling and writing and so forth. And he set himself to learn Ainu, and which he did, just for the pure pleasure of being able to read, not to write anything about them, but just for the pure pleasure of being able to read what he could find that they had written. Extraordinary.
Yeah, he was very remarkable, a very remarkable man.
Yeah. But he was interesting, too, about Roger Fry and Clive Bell, because they were great theorists, of course. Bell, I think, the painter more than Roger Fry. And Clive Bell had just formulated at that time, around about 1912, 13, 14, his theory of plasticity and the whole question of sort of objectivity and plasticity in art, the form of art, and the question of sort of plastic form, emotional form, and how that related to one's thoughts. And so there's a kind of a sort of almost neurological sort of dimension, and he was quite seriously including that and highlighting that. And that really, of course, gave rise to that exchange between Roger Fry and Waley, when Roger Fry said that you had to understand paintings in terms of form. There's no other way to do it. And also Waley said, of course, you can't really begin to understand these because they're Zen works. They're quite different. And you can't begin to understand them like that. But it's interesting when you read the catalogue introduction. Margaret, my wife Margaret, God bless her, had the most wonderful and now exceptionally rare and important catalogue of the post-impressionist Impressionist exhibition of 1912 at the Grafton Galleries, which Roger Fry introduced with his beautiful catalogue that he illustrated with Vanessa Bell, with his cover drawn to his design by Duncan Grant, who incidentally also drew the cover illustration, the dust jacket illustration for the 1942 translation of Monkey, or The Journey to the West. And anyway, this wonderful catalogue that Margaret had, or we have here, has essays by Roger Fry and Bell talking about this precise subject, but in a very different way. And that's the original text, and that's the text that Waley comments on when he has the conversation or the exchange with Roger Fry, and no doubt with Clive Bell, who I don't think really knew much about Zen or Buddhism at all, but Fry was interested in both. He was interested in that and took him seriously.
Yes, and I
Oh,
suppose.
sorry, that's a bit of a digression, that, but never mind.
Well, yeah, I think it's a lack of narrative, isn't it, in Eastern paintings that people find intriguing, and that's the
Yes,
thing. It's just the direct seeing things as
that's right.
just a reflection of things as they are.
Yes. Did you say lack of narrative?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm just curious as to why Arthur Waley never visited Japan, because having studied classical Japanese myself and read quite a lot of the literature, I would have imagined that it might have cast, this idea of the intellectual approach versus, imbuing yourself, excuse me, in the political, historical, social, and cultural context. Why he never visited Japan. I'm just.
Yes. Well, I don't want to sound presumptuous or indeed be presumptuous or presumptive in that sort of way, but I think the reason could be, shall we say, I won't say it is, but I think the reason, one reason might be that the Japan and China of Arthur Waley's intellectual life was precisely that. It was a land that he had reinvented for himself. And I think really that he was, as one finds in the case of other writers, other artists, musicians, painters, sculptors, this having been reached, they don't want to be disillusioned. They can't face the possibility of disillusionment. And not only were the works that he was translating sufficiently intriguing and difficult and beautiful and challenging in their own right, but they represented a world that he was creating continually for himself, just as one does or did in the old days when we listened to the wireless, as I persistently and determinedly call the radio, because there you had to sort of create a world of your own in a visual sense, because you couldn't see what they were talking about. So you had to put all these people you were listening to, these disembodied voices, had to somehow be grounded, and then instinctively and naturally you were making that world for yourself. And I think that's what he was doing with his work, and I don't think that he really felt that he wanted to find anything different. He didn't want to go to a world where there were cars and trains and all sorts of things. He wanted to be in the time of Wu Cheng-en, for example, when he translated Monkey, and in the world of Lady Murasaki when he translated the Tale of Genji and so forth. That was the world that he wanted to inhabit, I think.
On the back of that, could I ask a question, please?
Yeah, go for it, Bob.
Hi there. Yes. On the back of that last question, I was just wondering what the impact on Arthur Waley was of the Cultural Revolution in China.
Gosh, the short answer and the truthful answer is I don't know. I can only sort of I can only imagine what his feelings might have been if I compare people I did know who were involved in different aspects of different countries that attracted them both historically and as travelers, and men and women. And I can only imagine that he was absolutely horrified. I don't think he could have seen it very I think he would have made an effort to be objective because he had that sort of mind. I mean, whereas Beryl was essentially an intuitive woman who she worked, she had a kind of almost Zen-like sort of approach to life, but she worked on a sense of impulse and spontaneity all the time. She saw things intuitively. That's how she received her impressions, and that's how she transmitted her impressions, which gave her that sort of invisibility. And indeed, Arthur Waley's translations, like all good translations, have that sense of invisibility as well, because he's recreating rather than just translating. But I think at the same time, when it comes down to it, that he had a more objective, maybe a more rational view of life and view of the world. And I think he would have tried very hard to make sense and reason of it, but I think he would have felt repulsed by it. He wouldn't have felt, put it this way, that's maybe too strong. I think he would have felt completely out of step with it.
Thank you very much, and I'd just like to thank you for such a wonderful talk this afternoon, so elegantly delivered.
Oh, well, thank you.
Mr. Maitland.
Well, I read it, I'm afraid, so I was cheating a bit at this end. That's the advantage of the telephone. You can get away with things. No, but it's an interesting point you've made, because it reminds me, if I may, I don't like sort of harping on about sort of things too much, but I had a very dear old friend called Sir Wilfrid Thesiger, who was a traveller and writer and photographer, and a man of great distinction and interest, very great, great creative sort of mind and ability. And but he read history when he was at Oxford, and he always insisted that he had a romantic view of history, which may come closest to answering your question, because he used to say, when he was really rather down in the dumps and looking at helicopters flying over the Thames and things, and feeling rather depressed, and he would say that he was somebody who cherished the past, felt out of step with the present, and dreaded the future, which sounds very gloomy, but it was just placing himself in that historical world that meant so much to him.
Yes, thank you. I could see that. I could kind of empathise with that point of view. Thank you.
Yes, you needn't agree with it, but it's certainly a perfectly valid point of view.
Do we have any more questions from the floor?
Thank you so much, Arthur, for. Oh, sorry. It's cut off now. Sorry, it's cut off. 1 second.
We can hear you.
Can you?
Senaka, yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much for your talk, Alexander. Now, I just want to know if Beryl had any connection with the Marg group in India, because at almost around the same time they were discussing forming a publication, and there were a lot of like emigre art historians and artists who had left Europe during the war and settled in India and started looking at what a modern Indian architecture and art would be. And I was wondering whether Beryl knew of. Well, I know Beryl stayed with Minette de Silva, for example, when she was in Canada.
That's right.
So I just want to know if there were any other like connections like that.
Again, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm not absolutely. I couldn't absolutely swear to it. I'm perfectly certain that she was aware of it. I've no doubt of that at all. Just as she was aware of, modern indigenous artistic movements taking place after the Second World War, for example, in Sri Lanka and notably, of course, well, during the war already, but with the after effects of it, notably, of course, Lionel Rent, the photographer and painter's 43 group, and there were others, other people active, of course, at the same time, local people and Europeans who had domesticated there and so forth, or had travelled there, writers, painters, sculptors, photographers. And I'm absolutely certain she was aware of that. But again, I think that her visits, I think that the time that she spent there in these countries, and in Bali, of course, she was there for a long time, South India and in Sri Lanka. I think when she was there, I think that her time was so focused upon her purpose, which was essentially to discover what she could about the traditions of dance traditions in these countries. And she was seeing a link between Indonesia, South India, Sri Lanka, and so forth. And she wasn't quite sure sometimes which one came first. I mean, for example, she thought she could see, for example, how her book, The Other Mind, about South India, maybe was almost a sort of precursor, in a sense, of her work in Bali. It just depended how she came to it, but that was essentially her focus. And so I don't think, I don't know any examples to make it to be more specific. I can't think of anything just off the top of my head which would answer your question satisfactorily. But I think that's really what lay behind her time there.
And was there any, sorry, just to follow up, was there any link with like Leonard Woolf, for example, with the Bloomsbury Group?
Oh, with the Bloomsbury Group, oh goodness me, absolutely root and branch. They were immersed in it, absolutely immersed in the Bloomsbury Group. They couldn't fail to be, because the Omega workshops, of course, were number 33 Fitzroy Square, and they lived all round about that area, that huge area, all owned by the University of London, and they were part and parcel of it. And I'm not sure. Well, you know that wonderful phrase about that it's meant to be funny, and it's probably too trivial. I don't want to spoil the tone of this afternoon, but why not have a laugh? I love that sort of remark that somebody, a friend of theirs actually made, and he was thinking especially of Dora Carrington, her husband, and Lytton Strachey, when they all sort of lived in a sort of ménage à trois. And of course, Vanessa and Clive Bell went down to the country and had their lovely house, Old Vicarage or whatever it was there, and founded the Charleston Artist Group, which was a kind of, a sort of, if you like, a sort of strand of the Bloomsbury Group. But the lovely remark about the Bloomsbury Group, that they lived in squares, painted in circles, and loved in triangles, which I think is actually uncannily accurate.
Well, I think we can thank you, Alex. Unfortunately, Desmond had to you couldn't see him because you're on the phone, but he just had to nip out to help the London Buddhist Vihara do their interfaith event tonight, which
important.
Happened a little bit earlier than planned, actually. So
yeah, but all important. Anyway, I didn't disgrace myself in front of him, thank goodness, with that silly remark about the Bloomsbury Group.
No, not at all. No. So thank you very much.
I do hope you all enjoyed it.
Enormously.
Have a lovely weekend.
Yes.
Thank you.
Keep safe, keep well, and keep dry.
Okay.
It's pouring outside.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you.
Have a lovely evening.
Bye, Udi.
Okay. Bye-bye.
And you.
Bye, Mom.
Bye, bye, bye. Bye, bye. Bye, bye.
Bye, Alexander.
Bye, Lavinia.